Klein. I'm a certified saddle fitter through Mike Scott and Peter Corbin. I'm also a biomechanics trainer. I do classical foundation training for all disciplines, as well as show and dressage and eventing myself. Today I wanted to make this video about the skeletal and soft tissue landmarks for on the horse for saddle fitting. We have our horse mapped already, so we're going to talk about that. I've noticed, not only in my area, but also kind of all over the country and even in other countries, that there's a major difference between saddle fitters and saddle salespeople. You have your saddle fitters who understand anatomy, they understand the biomechanics of the horse, how they're supposed to be moving. And the saddle salespeople tend to just want to get you into a saddle. Really, their main goal is to sell you something, and sometimes the fit isn't always ideal for your horse. So then you're left buying new saddles every year, your horse is unhappy, they're not coming through, you have a lot of problems. So hopefully this can kind of help people understand why and understand what to look for so they can kind of guard themselves and their horses. I will say, please, please, please always use a certified saddle fitter when you're buying a new saddle. This is not intended for people to be able to go fit their own saddles. You need a trained eye, you need a trained person to do that. So please use certified fitters. But this is supposed to be a tool to help you guard yourself and your horse against some people or companies or whatever that maybe don't represent themselves the best. So the first big part that we're going to talk about is the scapula. So the scapula is pretty easy to find. If you find your wither, which is pretty common, people typically know where the wither is, and you come down, you find kind of a hard, bony landmark. So her scapula is this big oval that runs right through here. It's quite large, and in all horses, it's quite large. All right? Big round thing. And then she has her humerus, which runs right here. The horse's leg, as the horse's leg comes forward, the scapula actually rotates kind of back and up and kind of in this section through here. But as she brings her leg forward, you might be able to see that the scapula actually kind of slides back, and then it goes back forward, and then it can kind of go backwards again. So, super, super important that you have a saddle that allows the scapula freedom of motion. Because, as you can imagine, as your horse is moving naturally anyways, you want them to be comfortable. You want them to not be impeded, but especially if we're jumping or anything like that where your horse is really needing to stretch, it's super, super important that the scapula has the freedom of rotation back here. So the second thing we're going to talk about is our trapezius muscle. There are two sections to your trapezius muscle. You have your thoracic section and your cervical section. We're mainly going to talk about the thoracic section, but both have important parts when talking about saddle fit and the way your horse goes. So your thoracic section of your trapezius muscle actually originates between the T10 and the T3 vertebrae. The T10 is going to be at the base of your wither, so it's pretty easy to find, literally at the base of your wither. So it runs through here, it inserts into the spine of the scapula. Your cervical part of your trapezius muscle actually originates kind of in the nuchal ligament and then also comes into the spine of the scapula. All of this is related to each other. So you can imagine if you have a saddle that really sits on the wither angle and sits deep through this section, it's going to impede this muscle. It's not going to allow your horse to, number one, lift their back. See if she'll do it. Yep, a little bit. Carry themselves. They can't put their head down. They can't come on the bit. So all of this is super important if you want your horse, this big word, self-carriage, right, that we're always searching for. Your horse simply can't do that if any of these structures are impeded. So, super important. The next step, or the next part that you hear saddle fitters talk about a lot is your T18, or your last rib. Good way to find your last rib is to palpate the big hip muscle, which is pretty easy for people to find. You run your hand down until you find the first kind of bony structure. It's kind of hard. and then you follow it up at a curve because ribs curve, right? So you want to follow it that way. Another way to do this is to actually find where the hair comes and meets. Follow it straight up. So this is going to be your T18. You don't want to sit behind this because you can imagine your ribs all curve, right? They all kind of come up into your spinous process and they all curve down and down and down. They protect the organs. Well, your lumbar vertebrae actually stick out like spines. They come straight out and they actually sit above your rib cage. So if you sit back here, you're actually putting pressure on these spines. This causes horses to not be able to canter correctly. Again, doesn't allow them to just carry themselves, to go on the bit, to travel well. It causes a lot of pain and a lot of long-term damage. So it's really important that our saddle sits in front of that T18 vertebrae. The next part we're going to talk about is our channel of our saddles. Sometimes, depending on who you talk to, this isn't really looked at that much, and that's troublesome. So, how to find the rib heads, or how to find your spinous process, is to follow up until you find like a little ridge. There are tendons and muscles that run alongside your spinous process, so you don't want to put pressure on those. As you can imagine, that's going to cause a lot of pain. The second part is going to be your rib heads, which sit down here. You follow this down until you find like a little ridge. Again, her rib heads sit here. What happens if you put pressure below this is that you actually start to rip and tear muscles away from the spinous process. Super, super painful. Kind of uncommon, but it does happen, and it's definitely something that your saddle fitter needs to be aware of. So, this kind of half rectangle trapezoid thing is going to be her bearing surface, and your horses would look very similar to this with maybe some different dimensions. So research actually tells us that if you have a saddle that fits these parameters and has a bearing surface that sits here and is flat and is smooth and is nice for your horse and matches, your horse can actually go for up to 8 hours with 350 pounds on their back without doing any damage. Now, I don't recommend riding your horse for 8 hours at a time, but it really goes to show how important it is that your saddle should sit there for the comfort of your horse. Again, you can do just a lot of damage if your saddle sits anywhere else. So, again, super, super important. So that is the basics of saddle fitting. Again, please use a saddle fitter who is trained and certified, who understands anatomy and biomechanics when you go to buy a new saddle or when you go to evaluate one. But hopefully this can kind of help people to understand the basics and then kind of guard themselves and their horse. Because I feel like people are kind of out on their own whenever they're talking about saddle fitting.